calculated on a consistent basis. So all through roughly the mid-1980s up until just recently, inflation's running like 10, 12%, and the government's telling you that it's something like 1, 2%. And just recently, in the last couple of years, they're telling you that inflation is virtually zero. And those of you who are getting Social Security checks, you've now seen zero increase in your Social Security increment for 2011, and you saw zero increase in your Social Security check for 2010. But the truth is that all of us, as soon as you go into the street, you see that prices are rising. And here in New York, one of the good examples of that is what's happening to mass transit. This comes, by the way, from the Wall Street Journal. They have upped the mass transit fares in New York. A single ride is up 11%. The 30-day card is up close to 17%. The 7-day ride is up something like 7%. Go to the next slide, please. And this shows the Long Island Railroad up something like 9%. The Verrazano Bridge is up 18%. The Brooklyn Bridge, I'm sorry, all the bridges. We're talking about the Throgsneck Bridge, the Queens Manhattan Midtown Bridge. All of this stuff is up on an average something like 11, 12, 13%. We're not talking about 0%. And every time you go into the supermarket to buy something, we're not talking about 0%. We're talking about very substantial increases. But it's not that the prices are increasing, folks. What's happening is that the money is depreciating. Now, I want to talk now about I skipped a slide. Sorry, let me just stay with this one. I stay with that slide. I messed up my order. One of the things that's happening is that some establishment figures are beginning to comment on this. And here's a quote from Jeffrey Garten. Jeffrey Garten was a high-level official in the Clinton administration. He's the former dean of the Yale Business School. He's written multiple books, sometimes author for Business Week. And here, writing in the Financial Times, this is an incredible statement. He says, Washington will therefore have little choice but to take the time-honored course for big-time debtors, and here are the key words, print more dollars, devalue the currency, and service debt in ever cheaper greenbacks. In other words, says Garten, the United States will have to camouflage a slow-motion default because politically it's the easiest way out. Well, what does that mean, a slow-motion default? It means instead of paying the debts with money that has the purchasing power when it was undertaking, they're going to be paying back these debts with money that's depreciated greatly, in effect cheating people who have saved, but more importantly, maybe just as importantly, cheating people who have payments of future promises of future payment, people's pensions, people's security, Social Security. I mean, this is outrageous, and there is nobody talking about this. It's not on the national agenda. The major media doesn't want to print anything about it. The only place you hear about this is on the Larry Park Show, and of course you experience this every time you go into the street. So what I want to address now is how did we come to this juncture? And the bottom line is that the Congress has authorized the banking system to create money out of nothing. The banking system consists of the Federal Reserve, which is a creature of the banks, and the banks themselves, which are privately held companies. So here you have these privately held institutions which have been empowered by the Congress to create money out of nothing. And the way they get away with this is they've disguised this by jargon. Well, people use jargon for different reasons. One reason is that in specialized occupations, you need special language as a shortcut instead of having long phrases and whatnot. But most likely, people use jargon because they don't want people to understand what they're doing. So, for example, an egregious example, when the Nazis were rounding up the Jews and murdering them, they didn't say we're going to round them up and put them in boxcars and ship them off to concentration camps and put them in gas chambers. No, they didn't say anything like that at all. They said we're going to solve the Jewish problem. And so in the case of the money creation, they don't come out and say with the stimulus, for example, we're going to create $800 billion flat out of nothing and give it to the banks, which is really what's happening. No, they say they're going to inject liquidity into the system. And when the banks create money, and by the way, every time someone takes a loan from a bank, the bank creates the money for the loan. They don't say, look, we're going to do a book entry and create the money. No, they say they're doing fractional reserve lending. So they use jargon, and in effect, they confuse people as to what's really going on. Go to the, let's have the next one. So until 1971, this money creation was limited because foreign governments and foreign central banks could redeem that paper ticket electronic money at the rate of $35 for an ounce of gold. And because the amount of gold was limited, this put a limit on how much money could be created. But come the late 1960s, when the Vietnam War was heating up, as always the case when there's a war going on, the government needs money to prosecute the war. And where did they get the money? It was all created flat out of nothing. Again, nobody talked that way. But in effect, as they're creating money out of nothing, some of it's leaking overseas to our trading partners. In those days, Germany, France, Britain, Japan, and some of it was starting to get redeemed for gold. And in fact, de Gaulle made a big speech in 1969. He said he wasn't going to allow America to buy up Europe, really meant France, with printing press money. He starts redeeming big time. And when this whole debacle started, roughly when they did the Bretton Woods Agreement, when they made the dollar the so-called the reserve currency, the United States had 22,000 tons of gold in the treasury. And by 1971, it was down to 8,100 tons, and it looked pretty much like it was all going away. The next thing you know, President Nixon, he said temporarily, defaulted on this promise to redeem. And after he defaulted on this promise to redeem, the money supply just took off. It exploded. So if you look at the chart, this is a chart of the money creation by the banking system. In 1946, there was roughly 6 billion with a B, 130 billion, up from roughly 6 billion prior to World War II of money in society in America. By the end of 2008, that had ballooned to something north of 14 trillion. Went from roughly 130, 150 billion in 1946 to something north of 14 trillion. And you see, it really exploded after the last tide to gold was broken. Well, nobody was talking in those days, and they're still not talking about all the money they're creating out of nothing. The spin for this, by the way, is that they're doing you a favor when they create this money out of nothing, because they say the money's going to build factories, create jobs, and whatnot. But what we see now is something like 50-some-odd thousand factories have moved away, to places like China, Vietnam, South Korea, South America, or whatnot, and roughly 8+ million jobs have been lost. And depending upon who you listen to, there may be as many as 20 million people in America who are unemployed or underemployed or permanently out of the workforce because they can't find work, all while they're creating out of money. So that's an obvious lie. But some of the insidious results of this money creation is that it caused a great deal of volatility in basic commodities, things like oil, copper, steel, aluminum. But the area where it created the most insidious volatility, I'm going to talk about this now in relation to pensions, was in interest rates. So here's a chart that shows the volatility in the 10-year bond going back roughly to 1926 to 2008. And what you can see from this chart is that the year-on-year change in interest rates up until 1971 was small. It was on the order of 0.2%. But after the last tide to gold was broken, that volatility became something like plus or minus 2%, went up by a factor of 10. And while that was happening, go to the next slide, please, the interest rates, where they used to be stable on the order of 2, 3, 4%, increased up into something like 14%. Now, it was the response to all of this interest rate volatility that led to the destruction of the pension system. And I'm going to explain to you how that happened now.